heart. You can hear and not listen. But if you are to listen, or if you listen, that means your heart. You did everything. So hearing, I think, is the first one. Then listening and understanding.
Then understanding. So listening increases your chances of understanding.
So hearing is a sufficient condition for understanding, but listening is a necessary condition.
Oh. So this content has, things around communication, okay? And you can look at it, pick and choose what you can retain. The rationale for communicating research findings has been covered a lot by Nazrina, so I'm not getting into it, but the whole point is you feel like a supplier of evidence, okay? And I got this actually from the knowledge translation group, I think, where they said knowledge is like fine wine. And the researchers are good at having it, brewing it and packaging it and storing it in the cellar and asking everyone, did you test it? Usually this testing is restricted within the scientific field by people who cite your papers, but it rarely goes to where you want it to go. And the whole rationale for knowledge translation is moving from the actual paper to its intended purpose. So, translating this knowledge, making sure it's well known, making sure it's commonly known, is part of that knowledge translation. So, this covers.
Yes, go back to that slide. Say a little bit of a funny story about that. Suzanne, you need to cite where you got that from. It's really interesting. When we were creating the knowledge translation toolkit, it was meant for IDRC researchers that are engaging in policy relevant research. And so the toolkit was supposed to be utilized by partners, research partners all over the world. One comment we got is a lot of our partners are francophone, so the whole toolkit is also in French. The second comment we got was from our Middle East colleagues. We didn't end up changing this, but they actually weren't comfortable with us using this analogy of wine. And that goes to say again about your audience, who's going to be using your outputs, their context, their values, their preferences. And so, although the toolkit retained this, it wasn't actually a very comfortable analogy for everybody.
But it does make a lot of sense.
Yes.
to that.
And I think then that relates to jargons, because what it means for one particular community might be different. I normally hear.
And we were trying to break down jargon by using an analogy.
This is more like terminology. Yeah. So. For research to have a purpose, it needs to be understood and acted on. You have not communicated. Until you understood, you have to know who, what, where, when to actually make this research available. I am actually going to run through these others.
But Susan, there is something you indicated there when someone is running with a paper and they want their work to get into there. And that takes me to the discussion around, as researchers, should we be advocates on the streets running with our things?
I'm coming to that on my next slide. How many of you want to influence policy? You know, we might be here assuming, but you actually are not interested. One hand has gone up, others have gotten the courage to raise theirs as well. Please show people your hands so that the courage can build across the room. So researchers are from different, perspectives and positions. Some researchers feel they need to. Some researchers actually fear that their scientific knowledge is privileged, and anytime they try to get into these processes, which are not very clearly demarcated in terms of evidence. They're going to dilute evidence, and they fear that, they might be challenged there. So they don't want to engage. They're like, I give you the evidence, use it if you want it. If you don't, just give it. Listen, I gave you the evidence. So there are a number of factors that dictate whether the research will be taken up. One of them is the researchers themselves and their incentives and motivation to take it a step further. The passion they have. Personally, I have nothing against a researcher who doesn't want to participate in this dirty game of policy influencing. But they can at least find someone who can do it for them. Someone who can help them in that role. An institution, an individual who can play that role for them. There are two, like I said, the strictly objective researchers believe that engaging in civic debate undermines their objectivity. They are going to be allowed or forced, influenced to take on positions which are not scientific fact. Because researchers are always saying, oh, we adjusted for this, and we adjusted for that, so it's generalizable within this population. Now, if a policymaker wants to make a decision, your adjustments are not the principal thing in their heads. So you engaging in that process forces you to kind of lower your scientific standards. Other researchers, they're too busy. They just want to do the science because that's what they get recognized for. And they leave that other stuff to the people who want. But unfortunately, whenever the researchers leave that playing field, you leave a vacuum, and you know the law of vacuums. The law of vacuums. Whenever there is a vacuum, other things will come and occupy it. So if the researchers who have their evidence decide to evacuate, you can be sure that they want to leave the space empty. So what do you prefer? Just something to consider. You leave that space for the lobbyists, the other groups who have their own interests. It's a risk that the policy process will go on without you. Okay? It will. And then you sit back and say, these fools. How did they even come up with that?
But thinking about that point, I've also been thinking as researchers, we need to work more closely with people who are in advocacy. Because the more I learn about it, the more I realize that this is a whole skill, it's a whole world, it's a whole, and you're just one person. But sometimes you cannot go and do the research very well and then go and do the advocacy. So I think also in our budgets, as researchers, often we just budget for one dissemination meeting and one policy brief and a journal. But I think increasingly we need to have a bigger dissemination budget that can allow us to engage with people who can put in time and who have the skills to get some of this information.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree that researchers are not solely responsible for doing this, and they're also busy. Some researchers are as busy as policymakers. I've been to some offices where they don't have time to read. Christopher.
I think that is very correct. But I think for me, there is a question you asked us, how many want to influence policy? My thinking was that was a different approach to ask the question. And the argument everybody had to put up there.
But
if you went out there to ask the researchers,
how far
what
are you really?
the objective of doing research, you will find a lot more than just how many want to influence policy. And it's just a handful of them who want to influence policy. So the point I'm making here is we need to go back to the basics to try and ask what is the incentive that there is in researchers thinking beyond getting the evidence to taking it somewhere for its purpose. If you look at the academia, I've seen many people who are really now in their middle stages of academic careers want to become first authors because the university now requires once you have 4 papers as first author, you are a professor. So now it's just a run for authorship. And who cares about where the evidence goes? Some of us are there, we want the money. It's not about the professorship, it's what does the professorship bring on the table or whatever. So I think my argument is we need to rethink how to change the mindset of the researchers.
It's mostly around incentives, really. The researchers' incentives is to publish and get recognized. There are not many universities, probably not any university at all. I don't know, maybe by show of hands you can tell me if your university recognizes you and promotes you based on your proven ability to establish linkages with policymakers. None.
I think from some of the discussions I had with a lot of academics in Kenya is their engagement in these kind of activities falls under the service aspect, of academic, like research, teaching, and service, and that was accepted as service. But the amount of weight that's put on that for scoring in terms of promotion wasn't very high.
Yeah, and also it depends on the interpretation of service.
Yeah.
Because for us, service is usually interpreted as you giving some time to the community within your professional.
Right.
Yeah. For doctors, to take some time and treat patients. And wonderful.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it has been Elizabeth and Christmas have hinted on it, that you need to put resources and I do believe you gave an example of wine. There is someone who makes the wine, the other people who test it and tell you that this is good or bad. But in other words, we are all different, have different things. You may be good at writing, you may be good at analysis, but even when it comes to dissemination, I think we need to put in place specialists or bring people on board during the whole process who will be communicating this information. And I think this is where things have gone wrong. We do everything from the beginning to the end, and we are the ones to disseminate. We don't get information from. And I think that one has also been a challenge when it comes to communication and dissemination. Otherwise, if you're not good at disseminating, there are people who are better than us at convincing the policymakers as to what we have found out, better than us who have done it. And I think we need to bring them on board. Trespass seems to be one of those people.
God has said we need the money.
Yeah, some understanding around this and what it takes. And I agree with Vincent that perhaps we should not be responsible for everything. But I also want to emphasize that that should not be an excuse for us to jump out of it completely and leave it to whoever wants to fill that vacuum. So improving the research to policy requires, recognizing the different environments and the different mindsets, accepting that decisions are made sometimes on accumulation. I don't know whether you have anything on the street level bureaucrat, because some of us, whenever we think of policy, we think of the policymakers at agenda setting, policy making, level, and we forget that you can even influence policy at the implementation stage, and sometimes that is the most important, because when policies are made, and many of you witness to this, the resources are often not made readily available to implement. So as a health worker on the ground, you look at the policy, they tell you, okay, all matters ABCD, and you interpret it according to your context, the available resources. So at the end of the day, your interpretation of that policy might actually differ from the policy. So the influence of the street level bureaucrat is very critical and how they read a policy. We've all heard of maternal audits. All of you have maternal audits. And all of you can actually testify that the way maternal audits are interpreted varies in different settings. How they are done, who does them, the process. They are adjusted to fit a context, they are adjusted to fit interests. I was discussing this earlier this week in Ghana, and I was telling them how midwives and health workers are thrown on the police car and taken when a mother dies. That happens in Uganda, unfortunately. But they say, you know, it's easier to blame an individual than to blame an institution. You're not going to throw the institution in the police car and say you are responsible for the death. So the policy implementers or the enforcers will have to get someone to blame for the failure of a policy. So they will interpret it according to how they can use it in their setting. So it's important to look at the street level bureaucrat and how they influence policy and what evidence they will actually throw out. Sometimes they will just throw out, or sometimes they will incorporate some additional evidence, run to the field and start researching on what? UHC. By the time your research is ready, the decisions have been made, and now you want them to be reversed on the basis of your research. So it's always important to have this kind of foresight, to have evidence available in that cooking window. Know your stakeholders, and also understand how information enters the process. So I'll stop on that one and move on to the next one, which is, this is a quick run through just to enable you to see what content you can give to your partners or your learners. My next thing is the stakeholder analysis. Who is your stakeholder? What was it for? I thought you had a hand up.
No.
Okay. What was the stakeholder analysis for?
It was about non-state actors in control of malaria.
And you wanted to know who you have on your side. Their influence, etc. So the stakeholder analysis helps you understand the additional resources and influence you can have for your work. Because you know you're not the only researcher doing malaria research. You're not the only person who is interested in malaria, its treatment, programs, policy, etc. So a stakeholder analysis helps you to understand the people whom you can potentially bring on board with regard to your research. So there is a presentation on stakeholder analysis and etc. and how you can deliver this to your learners at a later stage. Like I said before, this is a foundation. I'm running through it, but you have an opportunity to look through it, to edit it for your particular groups, to see what you can take and what you can leave. So the stakeholder analysis helps you identify people, groups, institutions which can affect your program, your project, your stake. Okay? Anticipate the kind of influence they have. Are they powerful? Could they block you? Could they support you? Develop strategies to get the most effective support from them or to reduce or eliminate the obstacles. It also helps them to it helps you to improve ownership of your findings if you bring them on board, like they say, involve them in the beginning. So they ask, how do you do it? So this content takes you through how do you do the stakeholder analysis. Some of it, why is it useful to researchers? Characteristics the stakeholder analysis, it's time limited. You could do it this year, and the stakeholders could change by next year. Why? Vincent, why is it time limited? I'll give you an example. For instance, time limited. Right now, a certain issue is what is important. And within a year's time, that issue is no longer the most important. Or time limited, the person, the things you're discussing right now, where these are the stakeholders you have, might be different. For instance, if you have community health workers being the issue being discussed, and then they say, no, actually they're looking towards another kind of arrangement. Your stakeholder analysis, you need to do another analysis maybe now for the second issue. So it's time limited, and there's an explanation for that, okay? It's agent limited. It is place limited, and it is policy limited, okay? So you need to appreciate the intricacies in a stakeholder analysis. However much it's time limited or agent limited, it's still important to do it, okay? So there are 3 types of stakeholders: primary, secondary, tertiary, and they will tell you, who they are. Livelihoods directly affected, livelihoods indirectly affected, people who influence and have an issue, okay? You need to know their characteristics, and you need to know how to actually identify the stakeholder, to conduct the stakeholder analysis. So you have a template and you fill it in. For instance, the first thing is to have the issue. I'll go back to the issue. What is the key issue? What is the stake? You all know what a stake is. Who knows what a stake is? A stake is an interest. A stake, actually the origin of a stake is that piece of wood or whatever they drive into the earth, and then they tie animals or other things around. It brings things together. That issue which ties things together is the stake, okay? From the English. So you need to know what the stake is. Because without knowing the stake, you can't define any of the stakeholders. Okay? And that stake is usually driven by your messages. What are your key messages? I was in a training early this week, and I had 6 PhD students. Just imagine from your research, and they couldn't tell me. You as a researcher should be off the top of your fingers, be able to say, one of the things we are finding is community health workers can increase women's knowledge on maternal and health issues. The second thing we find is that community health workers, on average, make less than 2 visits at facility. The third thing we find is attrition of community health workers is high or is low. So it gives someone who is going to make a decision on whether to keep community health workers or not something to work with. But when you look at your findings and someone asks you key messages and you refer them to your paper, then you're tasking them to actually go into your paper and pull out the messages themselves. So pulling out key messages is a critical skill which a researcher needs to develop.
Yes. So you're saying the PhD students didn't know their key messages, and that's a challenge I've felt sometimes. Sometimes you're doing some work and then someone asks you, what's the key message from this work? And honestly, you're like, yeah, they are doing so many things, but what is the key message? And I think there are certain things is it dependent on whom you're talking to? Such as if I'm talking to a mother, I might have, if I'm talking to the PS, if I'm talking to the district. So sometimes just, getting that research and getting a researcher is appropriate for the audience can actually be.
And it's a skill that a researcher committed to translating knowledge needs to have. For instance, if you know that health workers are not motivated, and they're not motivated because their health managers are not communicating, your message to the health manager would be, my research shows that the demotivation of your health workers is caused by the lack of communication. You need to try and communicate better, like A, B, C, D, this is how they prefer you to communicate. On the other hand, demotivated health workers impact on the clients. And your research might have shown that clients are disgruntled. So your messages to the health workers who are at the client interface will be different from the messages you give to the managers. Okay? So you look at your findings and you're able to package your messages accordingly. Now when you go to the policy level, you're not going to tell them that health workers should talk better to their clients. That is a bit too implementation level for the policymaker. They naturally expect it. It is like a given. But you tell them that the working conditions of health workers keep them from having a better attitude towards their clients. So the system should try and provide more resources for a particular, for these people to enable them to be empowered within their community. So you can see the messages, it's still the same finding, but the messages to the people are different. I don't know whether I've confused you more. Have I communicated?
But now that is, I think, again, I have an issue there, where you had that there are cases where they say researchers are vague in a sense that you don't really point at exactly what the issue is. So you can see you are putting some politics around the issue, and somebody will ask you, so what are you talking about? So there are two issues that should you be bold and just hit it because we know it, or we should try to play the politics around the issue so that they continue to sit down.
That depends on the kind of researcher you are.
I think it also depends on the expert wants you to come up with just the problem or the solution as well, right? Different kind of engagement.
And sometimes researchers don't want to give the solutions, they just want to say there are no resources on the ground.
You will find somebody
and
saying,
the policymaker asks, so which resources are missing? What are the gaps? And the researcher says, I'll have to go back and...
you see?
So you've dropped the ball, they have picked it up, you've dropped it.
Yes, and I've said two things. One time we had a national stakeholders meeting and we made a presentation to the policymakers and so on. And then when we finished, we said, so what do you want us to do? And we realized we had completely missed the point. So I think the messages we had were really not targeting them. But also you need to think of how to make this person interested in your work. If someone wants to tell you something, then they come and tell you, you know what, you're very arrogant, very rude, very unapproachable. You're not really going to take in what they're saying. But if they phrase it in a way that they're giving you a message, but doing it in a way that doesn't make you defensive and doesn't make you put up this block like you don't know what I go through at work. So sometimes, like you were saying, should we just diplomats? At times you hit it and instead the person puts a block and they walk on. So I also need to say how to phrase it so that it passes the message, but in a way that encourages the other people to take it.
Okay, if we are talking about donors, okay, that is good. But sometimes we talk to them as if they live on Mars and we are on Earth. As if these issues are they ours. What affects us or what we want them to hear is also they approve. But the way sometimes we present it as if it is our problem.
And sometimes we accuse, we are talking in an accusatory manner without appreciating the context and the challenges they're working.
I don't think that we always work so much on this as if, no, so it's our problem.
One of the key things is to identify the policy issue. For instance, if it's injuries, road traffic injuries, and how to manage them among pedestrians, that will have, you know, a list of stakeholders. So you need to identify your issue, develop a list of stakeholders, okay? Have experts who can, you know, help you brainstorm on that list, okay? And sometimes you can do a survey. You can survey people to find out who should be a stakeholder or who shouldn't. I know we've done a stakeholder analysis where we did a survey and we surveyed different organizations, different players who we knew had information on this. And as a result, we got others whom we didn't know about. So once you have your list of stakeholders, preferably primary, secondary, tertiary, you score them on interest based on a pre-agreed scale. You score them on the potential impact and influence, importance, alignment. Some tools are broader, okay? This is just an example of things. And I have an exercise in there where you can have someone to pick out a key issue, key message. For instance, 2/3 or 1/3 of health workers are absent at any one time within the facility, or half of them are absent. And that is an issue. Brainstorm on the stakeholders, primary, secondary, tertiary, what are their interests? Review the list. How would you want these stakeholders to change if this issue is to be addressed? If it's health worker absenteeism, you will probably want the managers to take note of absenteeism, track it, etc. You would want the professional bodies to emphasize on this during the training and during the, the oversight, basically. The health workers themselves, you would want them to know the impact that absenteeism has on the system and to try and reduce it. So the changes needed for each stakeholder could be different. And you have the stakeholders, how important is each to the success of your project? What role must each play, and what's the likelihood of them playing it? And what's the likelihood and likely impact of a negative response? Okay? So the scores are there, but they could be determined by anyone. So how do you present the stakeholder results is in there. You usually have a position map where you have high support, medium, low, non-mobilized, low opposition, high opposition, etc. And those can be presented, for instance, in a graph where you will have how people are mobilized or not, or where you have the opposition, okay? Then you have the force field matrix, where this is the most commonly used one, where you have the powerful, highly interested, mapped out in different points. When you read the literature, and I've prepared a folder with readers on each of these so that you can read more, because I knew I couldn't cover everything today. So this is about the stakeholder analysis and how to use it. Now, once you're done with your stakeholder analysis, you realize that audiences need a strategy to actually engage them. And that is what we are going in the next bit. But there is an exercise here where you can have, the learners brainstorm on stakeholders for reducing road traffic accidents, for instance, they list the stakeholders, they categorize them, are these primary, are these secondary, are they tertiary, what are their interests, what is their power or influence, are they aligned, and where you want them to be, and you can go through an exercise of them plotting these stakeholders on that force field matrix so that they can see who is an influential person you need to move from one point to the other. Moving on to my third. Any questions?
So,
I am under a lot of
I'm
duress.
trying to think about this stakeholder analysis, not become a session.
You are? Yeah, it is. It is, although it can be truncated to be a small exercise. For instance, us sitting here and brainstorming, it doesn't have to be 3 months of stakeholder analysis. It can be a 2-hour exercise where you sit with experts, you brainstorm, you score them on what you perceive as their positions and their alignment, and you summarize that and you're able to say, this is what we have. It doesn't have to take 2 months before you know who the stakeholders are. If you bring together experts who are knowledgeable about the area, road traffic accidents, you can actually know, you can have a map of stakeholders to work with.
So you did this before, how long did it take?
The one we did was a survey. It took probably 3 months, but we wanted a paper out of it. Sometimes you don't need a paper out of it, and you just want to know, for purposes of engaging, who do you need to engage? And this can be done in half a day or less, just to know where we are working, what is the situation. John, do you need to come and put on the third one, or I can do?
There's a classroom exercise that can be done in half an hour. No, if they were doing it as a half of
Yeah,
study, right? The
in
classroom
the classroom, I've actually done this in class around road traffic accidents. You give the class time to brainstorm on stakeholders, and they generate a list within a short time with one of the students just listing them. Then you ask them to tell you who are primary, who are secondary, who are tertiary quickly. Then you score them on power, influence, alignment, etc. And using these post-its, they can write the stakeholder on and they post. And it's a very quick exercise as a classroom exercise. The third session, please feel free not to tell me that I'm moving too fast. Because according to the time, I have 10 minutes to take you through 2 additional things.
If that exercise.
It actually does. It helps you to know where to focus your efforts. Because
I mean in practice, has the road safety policy changed? I mean in that.
no, I was actually giving you an example of what we have done in a classroom, training students, because this is what you're going to do also. You're going to train others on this. So it hasn't been done at policy level, it has been done in a classroom to teach students how to do it. But I can say that at a policy level, one of the things we've done under the manifest, you probably all have a manifest, is to find out who our stakeholders are and to aggressively try to engage them, to invite them to all our meetings, to make sure they hear the results. And it does work, because even if they don't take up the results immediately, when they have questions, you're the first person they consider inviting to their meeting. Okay? So it does work to get into this forum.
Bring very negative